Hello, and welcome to PS 2410 Introduction to Public Policy. My name is Natalie Cote, and I am your instructor for this course. I just wanted to start out by introducing myself a bit, and I'm going to give you guys an opportunity to introduce yourselves in the discussion boards. But again, my name is Natalie Cote. I have a Bachelor of Arts in Philosophy and a Master of Public Administration. I'm working on a PhD in political science. My major is public administration, and my minors are public policy and world politics. I live in Hamtramck with my husband and my 4 cats. I think you just saw one walk by in the background. That was Pazuzu. And I like watching Jeopardy, spending time with my friends and family, exercising, and cooking. So that's a little bit about me. And oh, here's Pazuzu again. He says hi. You'll see my cats come in and out of these lectures. So anyway, this course is an asynchronous course, which if you don't know what that means that we do not have any scheduled class meetings. However, I will be posting lectures for your review every week by the end of the week, and with plenty of time for you to review your readings and the lectures for each week before your weekly quizzes. So I'm just going to start out by going over the syllabus a little bit, just some key things that I want you guys to be aware of. So my office hours are on Mondays from 9 to 11 a.m. You can just hit me up over email, and I will be able to make a Zoom or Teams meeting with you that way, and then we can meet if you'd like to meet for office hours. I won't be physically in the office until the fall. The required text for this book, or for this course, are Thomas Berkland's An Introduction to the Policy Process, Theories, Concepts, and Models of Public Policy Making, the 5th edition, and Eugene Bardach's A Practical Guide for Policy Analysis, the Eightfold Path to More Effective Problem Solving, 6th edition. And any additional readings that I assign will be on the Canvas page under the modules section. So this course is about public policy. I am intending to familiarize you with the field of public policy, including public policy making institutions and processes, while placing an emphasis on the theory and practice of policy formation, implementation, and evaluation. So we'll essentially just be going through the 2 books, as well as going through additional readings that I assign based on theories that we're covering and applied topics. Last semester, someone asked me if this course would cover social justice issues, and it definitely will. So if you're interested in that, that will be good for you. And yeah. So, format of the class. The class will be structured in an asynchronous format, including posted lectures, discussion boards, and weekly readings. Weekly PowerPoints, readings, and lectures will be posted by Monday of the week they are scheduled on. That's why I said in the syllabus. Sometimes they may be a little later, don't worry. They will be up. And if they are indeed later, then I may modify when your quiz is due, based on the relevant content. Students are expected to complete all readings and post in the discussion boards 5 times throughout the semester. The 5 discussion board posts are due by the end of the semester, so you have throughout the whole semester to complete them. None of them are due at any particular time, and I'll post a discussion board each week, so you'll have plenty of opportunities to go through them and post. And you are also permitted to respond to other people's posts, although it's not required, and your responses, if sufficiently substantive, can count for one of your discussion board posts. Lectures will often contain information not included in the readings, and students are responsible for all of the information presented in the lectures, PowerPoints, and readings. And additionally, here's your first opportunity for extra credit. If you complete 7 discussion board posts, so that's 2 additional to the required 5, you will receive a 4% increase on your final exam. So I would recommend that you do that. It really helped students last semester. Additionally, there will be 10 multiple choice quizzes, and they might also include essays or short answers or matching, a policy analysis paper, and a final exam. The policy analysis paper is not due until June 18th by 11:59 p.m. And the final exam will be distributed on August 2nd at noon, and it will be due by August 5th by 11:59 p.m. So both the policy analysis paper and the final exam will be in the form of a file upload that you'll have to do and submit through Unicheck. However, the quizzes will not be submitted through Unicheck. And I'm just realizing I don't have a 10th quiz on here on my syllabus. That's my mistake. I'm going to review the syllabus, edit it, and then repost it for you. But your first quiz is due on Friday, May 21st by 11:59 p.m., which is next Friday. And that will be on the material we cover this week and next week. So be sure to do all the readings. That would be the Birkeland Chapter 1 and 2, Bardock Part 1, and the Bernstein article that I will be posting shortly after class. And after class, I will be posting the discussion boards for this week. Okay, normally and now I would ask you if you have any questions, but if you do, just go ahead and email me, and I will respond promptly. That is one thing I'm known for. I always respond to students' emails relatively quickly, and I wish to uphold that, so yes. Okay, now let's get into the content for this week, which is just the Birkeland Chapter 1, which goes over what is public policy. And there are many possible ways to define public policy, and there are some listed options in the book. The term public policy always refers to the actions of the government and the intentions that determine those actions. That's Cochrane et al. Public policy is the outcome of the struggle in government over who gets what. That's also Cochrane et al. Whatever governments choose to do or not to do, that's Dye. Public policy consists of political decisions for implementing programs to achieve societal goals. That's Cochrane and Malone. Stated most simply, public policy is the sum of government activities, whether acting directly or through agents, as it has an influence on the life of citizens. That's Peters. So as you can see, there are many different ways to define public policy. Generally, all of the different definitions have these things in common. They refer to the actions of the government, particularly the policy-making actions of the government. They have to do with goals that the government has set for their own policies that they make, and they have to do with outcomes of policies. So essentially a really good one, I think, is the Dye definition, whatever governments choose to do or not to do, because essentially anything that the governments do, the government, and why I pluralize it is because there's a federal, state, and local governments, but anything that the government chooses to do is essentially public policy in any form. And be aware of these definitions. They are probably going to come up on your first quiz. Okay, now my cat is biting me. He's a little demon boy. That's why we named him Pazuzu. Anyway, key attributes of public policy, and just so you know, I'm going along on the on the first PowerPoint that I posted to Canvas already. So it's made in response to some sort of problem that deserves some sort of government response. So not all problems you might think deserve some sort of government response, but the ones that do get made into solutions, which we call public policy. Is made in the public interest, which is put in quotes here because it's difficult to define, notoriously difficult to define. Essentially, the public interest is the sum of what the interests of all the individuals are in the country, however defined. And even determining what one person's individual interest is really difficult matter. So it's even more difficult when we think about summing them up. However, we think about things like education, healthcare, roads, and other sorts of infrastructure as in the public's best interest, as these are things that the public needs to survive and thrive. But we'll talk a little bit more about what it means to distinguish between the public and the private, and what the public interest means a little bit later. It is interpreted and implemented by public and private actors who have different motivations and therefore will bring different interpretations of problems and solutions. So the people who implement public policy are generally known as bureaucrats, and they're, in a sense, kind of lower than the legislators who make public policy. Bureaucrats respond to the legislators as their political superiors, and they were required to implement the will of the political superiors' public policy, what they mean by public policy. And sometimes that gets difficult in parsing out what exactly a public policy was intended to do or what it means. And we'll talk a little bit about the difference between legislators and bureaucrats and other government officials later on in the semester. But just for now, it's important to know that there's a distinction between them. However, they're all involved in the making and implementing of public policy. It is oriented toward a goal or desired state. So all public policy has a goal in mind. Education policy generally has to do with educating the public in a better way. Healthcare policy generally has to do with making sure that people have insurance in a way that's affordable and accessible. Tax policy has a goal of, giving money to the government through redistributing money that the individual citizens have back toward the government so that they can enact their programs. So we think about public policy in terms of problems, solutions, and goals. And it is ultimately made by governments, even if the ideas come from outside government or through the interaction of government and non-governmental actors. So public policy is, in effect, only made by the government, even if the ideas come from outside of the government, either in the form of nonprofits or private corporations or lobbyists or interest groups or anything like that. But the government is the one that's responsible, or who is responsible for making the public policy that we have to deal with in the country. So then, what is policy itself? Birkeland defines it as a statement by a government at whatever level, in whatever form, of what it intends to do about a public problem. And we have some examples in the book. For example, DUI laws that state those caught driving while intoxicated will go to jail is a statement of governmental policy to punish drunk drivers. We could also think about, what other kind of policies do we have to deal with DUIs? Well, we have policies regarding how intoxicated you can be while driving. Well, that sounds weird to say, but you can be up to 0.08% of your blood alcohol level while driving, although that's not recommended. The government could have made it 0.00 such that no alcohol could be in your system. So there's a reason for that. And that states what the government thinks about the problem of drinking and driving. There's policies regarding rehabilitation facilities for people who have problems with alcohol, such as alcoholics or people who have problems with other drugs. Drug users, people with opioid addictions, etc. And those are meant to curb the rates of intoxicated driving. So these are all different policy solutions to deal with the problem of intoxicated driving. Similarly, the National Environmental Policy Act is a statement of governmental policy about how the government will make decisions that affect the natural environment. So you can take a look at that policy and see what that's about. The First Amendment is a statement about where the federal government will make no policy. And it's important to note here that a lack of such statements may be an implicit statement of a policy not to do something. So we have explicit statements of policy, which are explicit laws, procedures, etc. that actually do say they're doing something about a problem. And then there's implicit statements about policies that are statements of where the government chooses not to do something about some problem. And those are just as important as explicit statements. The U.S. government has never declared rights to education, healthcare, decent housing, or a living wage. So thus we can assume that the implicit policy is that there is no right to these things. Now that might seem a little odd because as a requirement for being a citizen of America, you have to go through school up to the point of 16. Similarly, you have to have health care. There are penalties for not having health care, and there are penalties for not attending school, both for parents and for students. So how can it be that the government has not said that there is a right to these things when they make it so there are penalties if you do not have them? Now that's an interesting policy problem that we can discuss in the discussion boards. But what I'll say about it now is that even though the government may not say explicitly that we have a right to these things, the government still intends to do something about these things, and obviously does, as we have lots of education policy and healthcare policy, despite there being no right to education or or healthcare. And you may think that there should be explicit rights to these things, such that, we have free education through college or even grad school, or free universal health care. But that would be your opinion, and you would have to argue that, perhaps in your policy analysis paper. Explicit statements take different forms, such as laws, regulations, constitutions, statutes, case law, and agency or leadership decisions. So there's lots of different ways or forms that public policy can come into play. So now we're going to talk about the policy process and policy studies. And McCool argues that modern policy studies began in 1922 when political scientists sought to connect the theory and practice of politics to understanding the actual activities of the government. So prior to 1922, there was theory about public policy and politics more generally, but it wasn't really connected to the actual activities of the government. And so the policy studies program aims to connect these two areas. Laswell argued in his policy orientation argument in 1951 that the overall goal was to describe a way in which social scientists could harness their knowledge to improve the human condition within a democratic system. So Laswell's policy orientation was problem-oriented, multidisciplinary, methodologically and theoretically sophisticated, value-oriented, and grounded in the policy sciences of democracy. It placed the policy scientists at the center of the policy process. However, it fell short by seeking to remove politics from an inherently political process. So, there's an interesting question about whether politics and bureaucracy or politics and policy should be intertwined or if they should be separate. And we'll get into this throughout the semester. For now, it's interesting to note that Laswell placed the policy scientist at the center of the policy process, while you may think that the individual citizen or a legislator or some other expert ought to be placed at the center of the policy sciences. And you would have to argue for that to explain your position. That could be maybe a discussion board question or come up on the quiz. Hint, hint. And so, policy analysis focuses on the formal evaluation of policy impacts or outcomes, whereas policy studies are broader in scope, examining not just individual programs and their effects, but also their causes and presuppositions and the processes that led to their adoption. So policy analysis is about analyzing the implementation of policy impacts and outcomes and evaluating them to see how effective they are at achieving their goals, whereas policy studies is a much broader area of analysis and scope, and focuses also on the causes and presuppositions of programs and the processes that led to their adoption. Now, this is mostly just important to orient you toward what public policy studies is all about. This probably won't come up until later in the semester again, when we talk about different theories of the public policy process. So now we get into politics in the policy process. And one way to conceive of politics is as a process by which societies help figure out how to organize and regulate themselves, that is, how to govern themselves. Another definition of politics that's really helpful is it's a study of who gets what, when, and how. So politics determines who are the recipients of public policy, what they get, and how they receive it. And it's generally an argument, it generally comes out in an argument between political parties that bicker over how things should be done. But public policy is, in a sense, a bit, I don't want to say it's more neutral, but it's more generally directed toward the public good, or how did we term it earlier? Yeah, the public good. So that it can be, in a sense, apolitical or non-political, but we'll talk about whether politics and policy are always intertwined or not. But what makes politics political is its location in the public sphere, where decisions are made by the public to address issues that affect people in communities. So essentially what makes politics or policy in general political is that it's made in the public sphere not by the public, but for the public. In the public interest. That was the term I was looking for a minute ago. But some people think that public policy ought to be apolitical and divorced from political arguments or leanings or parties. And we'll talk a little bit about that. And essentially the people that think that are the people that think that bureaucracy should not be apolitical. Because bureaucrats' duty is to, again, enact the will of their political superiors, so they don't have their own political views that they impose onto policy. They're just doing what they were told to do. But we'll talk about whether that's possible or not. And then there's also the public versus private distinction. What do you think of when you think of the public versus private distinction? Well, I'm going to ask you probably in a discussion board what types of things you think ought to be public or are public, and what things you think ought to be private or are private. Generally, we think things that ought to be public are things like education, healthcare, taxes. Things that we think are private are, our religious beliefs, our moral beliefs, our sex lives, things like this, that the government should not have any rule over. Whereas the things that are public, the government ought to do things about. So essentially, the public versus private distinction is important for recognizing what is in the government's jurisdiction and what is not. And a lot of this is laid out in the Constitution. So then we get into the history of political philosophy, which will be relevant. So political philosophy is philosophy that's about politics. It generally has to do with the theory of political philosophy. And we start with ancient political theory by philosophers such as Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, who placed a value on the polis, or the society, the meeting place for people, where politics would be done. Plato wrote the Republic, where he outlined that society ought to be ruled by a philosopher king, which seems kind of like a dictatorship, right? Which is interesting given that ancient Greeks founded the notion of democracy. But there are other political thinkers in ancient Greece who wrote about democracy, like Aristotle. And then modern political theory began with Machiavelli's The Prince, which was written in response or for an advisor to a king who was trying to outline what the public sphere was. What is the goal of politics? And there we get some ideas regarding, the relationship between a king and his citizens, or things like that. Enlightenment political theorists such as Hobbes, Locke, and Rousseau brought a lot to the table. We'll talk about Hobbesian's state of nature and how he thought that pre-political society we lived in a state of nature where life was brutish, nasty, and short. In the Leviathan, he wrote this. And then we had to essentially sign ourselves over to a social contract, or the government, in a sense, to be ruled by a monarchy. But we apply these ideas to the idea of living in a stateless society and then signing over some of our rights to be ruled by any sort of government, even in a democracy. And we take democratic ideas from Locke's writings. He talked a bit about the state of nature as well, and how we transform ourselves from a stateless society into a political society, and Rousseau as well. And The Federalist was written by Hamilton, Madison, and Jay in the U.S. to ratify the Constitution. Has some very important ideas in there regarding the relationship between the federal government and the state governments and the importance of the Constitution. And then we also have Marx and Weber on social and political organization and institutions. Marx infamously was a communist who discussed the implications of capitalism and how they can be harmful to society. And Weber talked about democracy and education. along with Dewey. And then we also have more, we're going through time here, from the ancient Greeks all the way to the 20th century philosophers. And then we have another 20th century philosopher that's relevant, John Rawls, who talked about justice in a liberal society, in a liberal democracy, which is essentially what we live in right now. Liberal referring to the idea that many different ideas are accepted in this society, and they kind of compete with each other to determine what the policies will be. Rawls' is an important contribution was that he assumed, similar to Hobbes's or Locke's state of nature, he assumed that, or as a thought experiment, asked us to think about being in an original position where we're stripped of all of our demographic features, such as our age, our sex, our gender, our race, our level of wealth, and then we, in that original position where we have this cloak of ignorance, veil of ignorance over us, where we don't know what our demographics are going to be after it, we determine what the best policies are for the society without knowing anything about ourselves, such that we can determine the most just results. So that's just a little bit about the history of political philosophy. It will come up throughout the semester, but you don't really need to know each of the theorists and what they say. The ones that would be the most relevant to what we talk about are Hobbes and Locke, and we'll reiterate what they said and what their theories were when we get to that. Excuse me. I apologize, I have a bit of a cold. Okay, so then we get into what is politics. Berkland says the process by which society determines who gets what, when they get it, and how they get it. So again, a reiteration of that original definition of politics. According to the dictionary, it's the art or science of government. Political activity is characterized by artful and often dishonest practices. And we know that politics is a profession itself, as well as an object of study. However, it's interesting that politics has a negative connotation due to the fact that people use politics to gain and wield power, but it is not necessary to attach that to its definition. Indeed, many participants in politics and the policy process are interested in defining public problems and offering solutions to these problems in an honest way. However, politics gets the diagnosis or the the bad term of being dishonest because perhaps of the actions of lobbyists and interest groups that seem to be expressing their own self-interest onto the will of their own self-interest onto the public. However, we know that lobbyists and interest groups are not necessarily bad or dishonest, and we'll talk about that a little bit more when we talk about unofficial actors in politics and policy. So now we're going to get into what it means for public policy to be public. And it's important to note here that the dominant ideological foundation of our constitutional system is classical liberalism, which is the ideological system that emphasizes individual liberty and the ownership and acquisition of private property as a means to improve overall wealth and happiness and discourage social strife. So again, classical liberalism, and the reason why I call it our country a liberal democracy is because it's founded on these ideas of classical liberalism, is based on the ideas of individual liberty in the ownership and acquisition of private property. Now you would contrast this with a more communistic society where private property and acquisition of wealth is not as important, and individual liberty may be constrained. And among the many beliefs of liberalism is that power derives from the consent of the governed, and which means the people are sovereign. They govern themselves. That's what sovereign means, or sovereignty. So the government is by the people and for the people. And we can talk about whether that's really the case in the U.S. or in other countries, although in this course we'll mostly focus on the public policies of the United States. We'll talk about to the extent to which that is really true. So when policy advocates seek to induce the government to make policy, or when government actively engages in these actions that the advocates support, one can make a claim that the government does so in the public interest. So, because again, the government is by the people and for the people. The people are sovereign. They govern themselves. And public policy is related to the public interest because the sum total of all policies affects us all in some way. So we may not be affected by each individual policy. For example, I'm not affected by tax policies that are directed at the upper class, right? As I don't make that much money. However, I am affected by tax policy more generally. I'm affected by education policy. I'm affected by healthcare policy. I'm affected by infrastructure policy. I'm affected by all of the laws that are written into legal statutes, etc., and so are you. So this is why we care about public policy and why we study it, because it affects us. But it's important to note that we are not all affected by the same policies in exactly the same way. But still, the governments play an important role in every aspect of our lives. And we define the public interest as the assumed broader desires and needs of the public, in whose name public policy is made. And again, it's difficult to define the public interest. I may ask you in a discussion board or on the quiz how you individually define it, informed by what I've said and what the book says, or other sources that you found. But we know it's hard to define, but it's something to which all policy advocates appeal, and it's something toward which all public policy appeals, because public policy is not just made for specific people, it's made for the whole country. So why do we study public policy? Well, hopefully most people are concerned about the impact of policies on their lives. And policy studies are driven by problems that we all care about, such as being uninsured, or being poor, or being, what else? Having to pay too many taxes. You know, public policy can solve all of these problems, or it purports to be able to. How does it solve being uninsured? Well, the Affordable Care Act made it so it's easier for all Americans to become insured. How does it solve being poor? Well, we have welfare programs such as food stamps and direct assistance that some of us have been party to or not. And then how does it affect paying too many taxes? Well, we can vote for different leaders in government that may or may not raise taxes or lower them. And problems are defined as usually undesirable situations that, according to people or interest groups, can be alleviated by government action. And we'll talk about the distinction between conditions and problems, because not all conditions are problems. Conditions are just states of being in the world, and problems are things that we characterize in a negative way that need to be solved. And we'll notice that even the mere characterization of problems can be a normative act. And what do I mean by this? Well, a descriptive act is just saying how things are in the world. A normative statement is saying how things ought to be in the world. And defining a problem itself, saying that X is a problem while Y is not. X is a problem the government can deal with, but Y is something the government shouldn't deal with, is saying what the government ought to do. And in that sense is normative. It's moral. And so we think that ideally studying public policy will help us become more thoughtful and effective participants in the public policy process. I'm going to talk a little bit about evidence and argument in the policy process, which will be very useful for your policy analysis paper, so pay close attention. Evidence is useful in policy debate, but it is not always necessary. Sometimes we can appeal to argumentative and rhetorical devices in place of evidence at times. For example, relatively evidence is needed to make an argument if it is possible to appeal to common sense, values, or interests. And evidence and emotion play important roles in policymaking, and sometimes emotion can dominate evidence. And even the identification of a problem can be a normative judgment, which we just went over. So what is the distinction between evidence and emotional arguments, or rhetorical arguments? Evidence-based arguments are entirely objective. They are based on the facts. Whereas emotional or rhetorical arguments can be based on things other than the facts, such as opinions or feelings or emotions. And we'll talk about this when we get to the different theories of the public policy process about which types of arguments are actually more effective. But I just want you to think about right now when you were forming your political opinions, which I'm hoping is an ongoing process, but let's say, when you formed your most recent political view, which were you more swayed by? Was it an evidence-based argument or was it an emotion-based argument? For example, an evidence-based argument could be that there are 8,000 or so homeless people in Michigan. Homelessness is a bad thing. Therefore, we should solve the problem of the 8,000 homeless people in Michigan by giving them homes. That's based entirely on evidence or objective facts. I mean, the one emotional fact in there is that homelessness is a bad thing, but I don't think anyone would argue with that. That seems to be an objective fact. Although it is indeed a moral judgment when we put the term good or bad in there. So you see how they mix together. An emotion-based argument would be like, here's the story of a particular homeless person that's meant to elicit your pathos. That's meant to make you feel bad. Therefore, they're in a bad way. They didn't do this themselves. It's not their fault that they're homeless. Therefore, we should give them a home. Which type of argument are you more swayed by? And that could be a discussion board question. And then finally, we get into the case study of, does the DARE program work? And I'm assuming that many of you guys grew up with the DARE program. The motivation for which was that drug abuse is associated with poor academic achievement, crime, and significant health problems. But essentially what would happen, I'm older than you guys, and you guys are a little younger, so maybe you guys didn't have DARE in your schools. But what would happen was, police officers would come to school and tell you, what could happen if you started doing drugs or continued doing drugs, all of the bad consequences. And it was supposed to foster good relations between the student body and the police officers. It was also supposed to sway you from doing drugs at all. However, there's little social science evidence to suggest that the DARE program meets its goals, but it continues to be an important policy. And the program was founded in 1983 by police and schools in LA to address local problems with drugs and gangs, and it was subsequently implemented in the U.S. and internationally. And the DARE organization refers to itself as a preeminent substance abuse education program. However, scientific evidence of its effectiveness is scant. According to the U.S. Surgeon General, it simply does not work. So if this is the case, why does it still work? Or, I just contradicted myself. If it doesn't work, then why is it still a program that we use? And the argument given in the Birkeland is that there are useful anecdotes that people tell about how it affected them, how they attended a DARE seminar and then they stopped using drugs or never picked them up in the first place. Or they fostered good relationships with the police officers and thus were never interested in using drugs, and then their life was great as a result. They had good academic achievement, good health issue, lack of health issues, etc. And these stories can be more influential than the actual evidence that DARE does not work. And even so much so that DARE continues to be a program today, I believe. It may have stopped a few years ago. So that's just an example of how anecdotes or emotional appeals can be more effective than evidence-based arguments or objective fact-based arguments. And so I just want you to think about which are more effective in terms of your own political opinion formations, and which kind of arguments do you usually use when you're trying to sway people to your side or against a particular position. And so for this week, all you have to do is read Chapter 1 of the Birkeland. And for next week, we're going to read a Bernstein article on public policy that I will upload, as well as Chapter 2 of the Birkeland and Part 1 of the Bardock. And I will have next week's lecture up by Monday. I hope you guys have a great week and weekend, and I will see you soon. Bye!